in and say something silly and then close it and walk away.
All right, and we're live. Welcome, everybody. We're part of the Bevry community and hoping to foster group collaboration and discussion over interesting topics on philosophy and pragmatic living for people. So, yeah, I'm joined today with Craig Reed and Tyler and Brett, or Pleasure of Doubt.
Hello.
And we'll be discussing John Vervaeke's 40th lecture of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. We might also go into episode 41 as well, since there is sort of a connection that's going on there, but we'll probably do that later on. Brett, you want to kind of lay out some of the opening kind of points of discussion, and then we can kind of get into each of those as we go.
Sure. So this episode, or these two episodes, are on wisdom and, more importantly, on rationality. And he's setting out again. He's a lot of what he's doing is trying to redefine terms a little bit. You know, taking popular conceptions or even philosophical conceptions of these words and trying to morph them a bit into a way that he thinks will, I guess, provide more meaning in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And for those who are watching joining us for the first time, this is a series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis that we've been going through week after week, and he's up to episode 4. We're up to episode 40 out of 50, where Vervaeke has gone through basically the history of what he calls the meaning crisis, and getting into what he calls the religion that's not a religion. So sort of how he thinks, modern day secular version sort of meaning making. And so wisdom and rationality are at the core of that. So he has a pretty interesting take. So he describes wisdom as a meta virtue for all the virtues. And he spends some time on the science of wisdom, that he basically defines wisdom as that what comes out of the science of wisdom is wisdom as the systematic seeing through illusion and into reality. And it's usually done through insight. So it's not just seeing, from his perspective, it's not just seeing through one illusion, but seeing through a pattern. So it's systematic insight. It can't just apply, it won't just apply to one problem, but it can apply to a whole slew of problems.
And he's clear to make the distinction between simply like knowing some sort of true thing, and knowing, but rather wisdom is more about like knowing how we came to know this certain thing, because then I guess it's more applicable in being able to use that same method in order to understand some other new thing.
Right. It's not just expertise, as opposed to it's like it's a way of knowing.
Yeah, the way of knowing. It's not just like, here's a list of facts and I know all these facts. That would just be knowledge of some sort. But wisdom would be, here is the steps in which I can go about learning new things. So it's sort of like the scientific method is a method one can put into practice in order to like produce facts or knowledge regarding things, rather than just reading a scientific textbook and then that's my scientific method, is reading this textbook.
Right. And so he talks about descriptive knowledge versus interpretive knowledge. So descriptive knowledge is grasping the facts, so just understanding the facts of any argument or just about an object or anything. Interpretive knowledge is understanding the facts, but grasping the significance of what you know. So in other words, relevance realization. It's a perspectival participatory aspect to wisdom. And he talks about pragmatic self-contradiction. So that there can be a contradiction in the perspective in which you make the statement and the identity you have in making the statement. So for example, if I say I am asleep, there's nothing logically wrong with that statement, but there's a contradiction in the fact that I'm awake. And I am wise, he says, carries with it also a sense of pragmatic contradiction. That to state that seems to indicate that you say you're wise, but when going back to the Socratic statement of, I know I'm not wise.
Yeah,
I know what I don't know.
Socrates was labeled the wisest man in Athens simply because he knew that which he did not know. and where everybody else in Athens seemed to think they knew a lot of things, but when actually questioned on like what is their basis for knowing these things, they really had no real response to that. But at least Socrates knew where his ignorance lay.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
There's also implied in that like a humility, that you understand that the sum total of knowledge is way vaster than you can lay hold of. So you have a more appropriate perspective to knowledge and wisdom in general, because you understand how little you know. So there's humility involved. It's awesome.
Right. So it has that perspectival participatory aspect to it. So it's not just about having belief, which is propositional knowledge. It's about your perspective that you can take, the identity you have, how you approach working through arguments or seeing through patterns. I mean, I've always thought of wisdom as, he describes it as seeing through the illusion. I always thought of it maybe as seeing the pattern. Now I don't. It seems similar. I don't know if that's identical.
Yeah, it might be that, like, similar to that, because there's also instances where we might see some sort of pattern, but the pattern itself is an illusion. And so it's kind of both
like
of those
seeing
things,
the real pattern, like seeing the real pattern, I guess.
A pattern that matches well against reality.
I can think of an example of that. I would agree with that. And like a wise person in like a social situation can read the human behavior underneath when people come up, and like they're so observant of human nature that they can understand the behavior patterns and play a deeper game than just your regular person. I don't know if that quite made sense, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. That's definitely a way in which somebody might have sort of an embodied cognition regarding personal people behaviors, and being able to kind of see behind it, like, what is it?
See the motivation, see like they can size up a social situation.
Seeing when somebody's lying just by the way that they're sort of,
or
like,
someone's playing one person off against another, and they know that people generally do that. You know, they bring a lot more information to the table in processing their ideas about what's going on, and a lot more background information. They're drawing from a lot of different sources, and it gets processed into this thing called wisdom. But there's part of it is seeing patterns of behavior.
And the flip side of that is seeing patterns, like John just said, that are wrong. But the same machinery that allows you to see the patterns also allows you to self-deceive. And we think we see the patterns that are there, but we're not. So I guess the core of wisdom is seeing through, is overcoming that self-deception. Now, of course, I mean, this is an interesting thing because, you know, we don't get, you know, a big check mark or light bulb, you know, big check mark doesn't appear over our head when we get it right. You know, we have to, I guess this is where sort of the Jordan Peterson style approach of, you know, what works, you know, when we have a pattern that seems to produce good results, you know, that we say that's a true pattern, you know, that's a wise pattern.
Yeah.
And I think,
and I know that's where he kind of gets quite a bit of flack from the rationalists, and saying, like, his sort of rearticulation of the word true as to be like that which is utilitarian towards survival as a living organism, when a lot, like, there's kind of the response to that is like, okay, why don't you just say this is wise, or this is practical, or this is and that's probably a good I guess rebuttal to it, or not a rebuttal, but at least a response as to his sort of pragmatic turn regarding truth. But I mean, at least in the circumstances in which the truth is inaccessible to us, we kind of only have what's pragmatic towards our survival, and kind of like what we're building off of here.
Or our survivor, our well-being, our, you know, what makes us, you know, even, you know, I like even the you know, making order out of chaos, you know, when we're able to, you know, work our way through the chaos. I mean, that's probably, that could be wise. I mean, that's where it's really that participatory perspectival. It's not just about knowing propositions. There's a real, I guess, active
Yeah. His example of the pragmatic self-contradiction really helped me in being able to kind of understand what he means by both participatory, in that, like, I'm referring to myself here, like I'm part of the story that I'm referring to, and so there's a deeper level, I guess, than just like making a statement regarding somebody else or regarding like an object in reality. I'm like referring to myself in that sense. So that's the participatory notion. And then the perspectival, where from the perspective of somebody who is, well, for his example, if I was asleep, I would not be able to make the declaration that I am asleep. So from that perspective, that statement cannot really be made truthfully. And it's funny, he brings in how that same sort of pragmatic pragmatic self-deception or pragmatic self-contradiction can occur in other instances where we have a great amount of expertise in one domain, and then if we try to sort of make a declarative statement in another domain, where our expertise in the other domain might be actually hindering us in being able to do so. So the example he gave, sort of like throwing shade at Stephen Hawking without actually naming him.
I caught that.
So Stephen Hawking, in one of his books, made the declaration, philosophy is dead. And of course, kind of Stephen Hawking is world-renowned physicist. And so his expertise in physics was exactly the thing that was kind of limiting his ability to recognize that the declarative statement, philosophy is dead, is a philosophical statement. And so you can't make that sort of statement from a physics standpoint. And
But what I was going to say, this ties into that actually, because the other thing is wisdom also implies like you have situational knowledge, you have propositional knowledge on depth on both levels, then you have knowledge of relationships. But probably the most important aspect is you have some self-awareness, and humility plays into that, so that you can actually critique yourself or see yourself in relationship to things, so that you wouldn't make the mistake that what's his face that he just mentioned made.
Yeah,
so because
Hawking,
you wouldn't go, wow, I'm the smartest physicist in the world, therefore it follows I know everything, I totally understand philosophy better than philosophers. So you would never make that mistake, because you'd automatically have humility, which wisdom implies, and knowledge of yourself first.
Like humility would be necessary in overcoming self-deception. If someone has no humility, they're much more likely to think they're never self-deceived.
Right. Or they'll never admit it to themselves when they're making big errors, cognitive errors.
I think I didn't take notes on it, but I think he threw subtweeting Jordan Peterson too a little bit, where he said later on in this lecture, where he says, be wary of people who only say that they're always misunderstood and not that they made a mistake. And I have a feeling he was
Peterson under the bus too.
Yeah, I have a feeling it was Peterson he's talking to, but he did a lot of subtweeting in this.
I didn't catch that, but I can see how that
may have been in 41. It may have been in 41.
Yeah, that was in 41 there. But I didn't catch the connection to Peterson, and it is sort of a criticism that could be made in that for all Peterson likes to speak about things that a lot of people kind of take as being controversial, and then his I guess defense is the fact that he was misunderstood, or
that's the meme anyway.
I want to try to take apart the notion of self-deception within the context of wisdom for a moment, if I may.
Sure.
It seems important to human nature, because it's something I consistently deal with, and it seems like many of us do. So I want to try to make it a concrete example for a moment of what might be wisdom. So if I walk up to a road where cars drive, can we say that it would be a wise thing to look both ways before I cross?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's wisdom, because it's a recognition of a pattern, and it's passed on as a phrase, which is to encode that pattern.
Yeah, for any dangerous situation, looking both ways is a wise thing to do. Anytime you could be
not when somebody says duck.
Sure. But in a situation where there could be fast moving objects in your way, as you're crossing. So it applies not just to this situation, but
Well,
you
yeah.
know,
So where you're going with that was probably sort of maybe where I'm going with it too. Is so let's say that across the road there is a very delicious candy bar, and there are some kids next to me, and we all see the candy bar at the same time. Now, do I stop to look both ways? I
if
have a
you're
rule
wise.
set inside me as a kind of sense of wisdom. And then there's a new scenario. And I think this is the realm of intelligence, is when we're trying to sort new information and make sense of it. And I want to know how it is that we choose the frame of reference by which we enact this set of behaviors. It's something like, oh, I should look both ways, but if I slow down, these other kids might get to the candy bar ahead of me. So let me think about that. Do I do
But
it?
if they get run over first, you can then have a straight path to the candy.
Okay.
Well, I was
Good
even
analysis.
thinking like, if you notice that the other kids look both ways and then continue running, then you can run without ever having to look both ways, because you can assume that they looked both ways. There was no cars, and so that gives you justification to continue running without ever looking both ways.
You guys are clearly very adaptive at this game. Awesome. Highly
Also,
intelligent.
wisdom implies a knowledge of priorities. So
Yeah,
you
I
would,
think so too. Yeah.
so you could shift gears almost immediately in different. It implies adaptiveness to different situations that you put in, because the wise person would understand their priorities, and maybe the priority, depending on how dangerous the road is, how good the candy bar is the candy bar even worth feeding the kids to? Is it money? Maybe I'd run for the money, but I wouldn't run for the. Wisdom implies that you could shift gears automatically and adapt to different circumstances, that it's a paradigm that's very flexible and it
Exactly. Right.
understands your priorities.
Because what would happen if you and I were sitting back on the porch watching the kids? What would happen if we saw that one run ahead to the candy bar? When we go to the next set of people and tell the story, it would be something like, don't run for candy bars, look both ways. It's like a reinforcement of the pattern, right? That is how the tradition feeds itself into the future forward value of it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
There's the thinker Nassim Taleb. He kind of hammers this point home, that we can't just look at the outcomes in order to make we cannot just look at the outcomes in order to determine whether the behaviors were wise to do because they produce those outcomes. We have to look at those behaviors in all the different possible worlds in which those behaviors could have led poorly. So like, it may be the case that in this world where not looking both ways led to them getting the candy bar, but in most other worlds, or even maybe like 60% of the worlds, not looking both ways before crossing the street will get you run over. And so that's a world in which that behavior is not adaptive. And so you kind of have to weigh the behavior across multiple domains, even if those multiple domains aren't even like actual or
Right, in
something.
multiple instances that
Right. Yeah.
if there may not be a car coming right now, but if I have the habit of always looking, I'm going to stay safe. Whereas if I don't have the habit, sure, lots of times there's not going to be a car and I'll be safe. But for those few times when there is a car, I'm going to be toast.
Right. All right. So Tyler, you brought that up in order to, I guess, go against the notion of self-deception. I'm not sure. You want to go into that further?
To go against it?
I don't know. You had mentioned something to do with self-deception. Like, are you just saying?
I just want to explore it. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think I was phrasing that as a.
Okay. What was the connection to self-deception then there with that example?
Okay. Well, that's what I want to know. I want to know, what is self-deception in that example? Are you deceiving yourself in the process of choosing to run for the candy bar without looking? Is
right.
That
okay. So it's a different
being assailed there.
Sort of a different way of like almost a different conception of wisdom that doesn't entail any sort of like overcoming self-deception there. It's rather just almost like practical wisdom and like what behaviors would be best in order to achieve one's goals.
Well, wouldn't the deception be that the chocolate bar is my number one priority at this time?
Right.
That would be the incorrect.
I mean, we can use different. I can use a different example where it's a little more salient or in your face, let's say, but that's the idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's
it's a very busy road, let's say. Very busy road. high likelihood of getting hit.
Okay, so I guess one way in which
It's
I could
hard to put
interpret it-
self-deception in this little example.
Well, yeah, I can kind of see your point there, Tyler. But I guess one way in which you could put self-deception into that scenario is the deception is the candy bar is worth more than not looking both ways. When in fact,
My safety,
looking both ways is sort of the optimal behavior to take. And so to not take that optimal behavior would be sort of a deception as to what is most valuable.
Or the deception is I don't have time to look both ways because
Right.
there's other people there.
And this is kind of like Vervaeke's whole point is
So then where would
together,
the deception lie?
Well, Vervaeke's whole point is kind of drawing rationality and wisdom in terms of relevance realization. And so by not having the relevant information and like looking towards the relevant information, that is a type of, yeah, I see your point. It's not necessarily self-deception, but it's like incorrect information grasping onto.
But it's still self-deception. It's I'm being wrong. I have my instincts that I just want that chocolate bar.
If I lie to you though, and you have an incorrect fact in your head, is that because you are self-deceived, or did I lie to you?
Sure. Yeah, that would be, I guess, external deception rather than self-deception.
No, but it's the process, it's the pattern. So your pattern is still the same,
Well,
whether or not
you have
it's
the
about
wisdom to trust me, right?
Well, it's funny. I've when I'm driving, sometimes people will wave, go ahead, and sometimes I won't go ahead. My kid notices and say, "Hey, he waved. Why aren't you going?" And I said, "Well, because he said go ahead, doesn't mean I still don't have to check myself to make sure the way is clear because he may have missed something."
The eternal skeptic.
Where's the locus of deception?
Desire.
Of trusting that the person who waved me ahead.
This would make more sense if you used a place where self-deception actually comes into play, because then you be analyzing, like you're kind of analyzing it improperly because it doesn't quite make sense in this context.
Well, that was
help us
Tyler's
out.
point. He was providing a scenario in which there is no actual self-deception occurring, while still there is wisdom being.
But I think there is self-deception in each of these examples we've been talking about.
Well, in like a classic example of self-deception would be something like, okay, you want to get ahead at work, and you're wise, and the boss comes in, and you kind of know that the boss is going to play you, but you go along with some program that he lays out for you, and you deceive yourself into trusting him more than you should, even though it's against your better judgment. Against the wise person will not participate in that form of self-deception that will lead to bad results. They will check themselves. The unwise person will. I mean, that's how it's normally talked about, self-deception. This example with the road and the thing, it doesn't really make that much sense in that context. I mean, if that's what he was trying to do.
The road is the boss. The candy bar is the thing you want.
I think it still works. I think
It's very much the same. Yeah.
There's lots of self-deception in the road example. I mean,
the
wisdom is pausing and saying, I have this other desire, but there are other concerns I need to take into account. And this is a pattern we can do over and over and over again across many domains.
Right. So
what about
I guess the
self-deception?
lie that one would be telling oneself in the road example would be this candy bar, or the attainment of this candy bar is more valuable than the checking both ways for my safety. That would be the act of self-deception there, I think.
Like that. That's fine.
And if I don't check both ways, maybe I won't even get that candy bar because I'm going to be smushed by a car. If I want to obtain the candy bar, I'm going to take the time to be safe, or else disaster can strike.
Sure. Yeah.
The dragon.
It's a fairly strong point there, Tyler. That there are points in which we exhibit wisdom that aren't necessarily overcoming some sort of self-deception. Like, an overcoming of self-deception almost seems like I have a model, I put forward the model, and then I realize where there are flaws in the model, and then I present a new model and act off of that. Whereas in the car example, I don't know if there's sort of that putting forward a false model first and then overcoming it. There could just be that you're putting forward a certain model and then acting on it, and that model happens to work.
I think overcoming, he means just seeing through more than, not necessarily that you have to have overcame something, but that you've
to use
the best
to use Craig's example too. So like when you go into that boss meeting and you do it again, you come out the end of that meeting and you go, why did I do that? Right? You kick yourself. Why did I do that one more time? That's when you notice the self-deception. And so I think the commonality in all these circumstances is something like not being aware of the motives that drive you. And that actually seems like it's outside of the self, right? And that it's in fact incorporating it into the self is what gives you a sense of control over whether or not it is deception. Right. So in the sense of the gut powerfully driving me, or my taste buds powerfully driving me to take the candy bar, it ultimately represents the most powerful urge. It wins in the end. I don't even have to talk about choice yet, but it wins in the end, right? And if after the fact I said, oh man, I almost got hit by a car, why did I do that? I can probably, if I want really hard, think back, oh, it was the urge of that thing was too strong. And then that will give you a hint of that, well, maybe I can downplay that urge somehow. And there's a self-regenerating cycle. That's the autopoietic cycle that must occur. But I don't know how to characterize it other than that process, right? Like,
right. So some of self-awareness is we're all prone to illusions and we're all prone to self-deceptions. The wisest person understands their own proclivities and how to counterbalance them and how to, how to handle yourself, basically. Wisdom implies not just knowing situations and other people and being smart, but having some type of regulatory observance of yourself so that you know when you're likely to make these mistakes and when you're likely to so there's an eye trained in on you as well, and you're critical of yourself, and you can be more adaptive in all different types of circumstances and apply the information correctly with some knowledge, with knowledge of yourself to bear also.
That's a great segue, actually, Craig, into kind of the next point in the lecture, where he kind of goes into this discussion within cognitive science as to whether or not human beings are rational. And it seems like, and the ways in which we can prove one way or the other if human beings are rational. And it seems like he's kind of he's not using like rational in the same sense that I think Aristotle is meaning, like the human being is a rational animal. Insofar as like I understand the way Aristotle categorizes things, it's like to say that human beings are a rational animal is to say that human beings have a unique faculty that is only capable of being had by them. And so that's not to say that human beings are going to behave rationally in every instance that they behave. It's rather that human beings have this faculty. And it may be the case that people don't exhibit this faculty, or maybe they even do it poorly in a lot of instances. But anyway, I guess the deeper question that they were really looking at is, are human beings like rational agents in a sort of I guess economic sense, or not, but not only tied to economics, but just in how we make decisions. And then this is kind of the question that cognitive science is trying to like look in.
Right, because there's parts of our decision-making process that are alien to ourselves and irrational, and what motivates them, nobody knows. Why we do weird things that we do sometimes that are self-defeating, and like wisdom implies that you've corrected some of that. Those behaviors that destroy or ruin other people. You're a wise person. You've learned to guard against those in your own life.
Right. Yeah. Brett, do you want to kind of go into some of the, I guess, examples that he laid out for like the ways in which we're reliably irrational?
Right. So first let's just talk about how he defines rationality, and that's really actually what a lot of what these two lectures are, is trying to work out a system of rationality. What is rationality? And the first thing he starts with, it's more than just, a lot of people, say in YouTube, and he draws some shade at YouTube rationalists as well, who think that really being rational is just having a faculty with syllogistic reasoning. And while that's a part of rationality, he says you cannot reduce rationality to just applying a syllogistic reasoning. Basically, because except in a limited number of circumstances, most of the time we don't have access to to enough of the premises to make a solid deductive argument. So it becomes combinatorially explosive with terms that we don't know, very fast. There are very few times where we can have where deductive logic applies in the real world. Math and logic, we can apply it in its, in the arguments. But in the real world, most of the time, we have to rely on inference more than deductive logic. So, and a lot of people out there think it's just basically dealing with that. So he wants to broaden the notion of rationality, which is the capacity to overcome self-deception in a reliable manner. So reliable means we're not looking at perfection, we're not looking at certainty, but the high probability of functioning successfully. I think I think of that in terms of high confidence. So it doesn't mean it's always going to work out. That's not the point, but it's going to work out much of the time. And systematically, it's not just operational in one domain. And this is where he goes into rationality versus expertise. I can have expertise in one topic. Like I can be an expert in tennis, he says. But that doesn't mean that my expertise in tennis will apply to playing squash. Rationality has to apply to a wide variety of domains. It's very similar to wisdom with a slight difference. I mean, and as he goes through, he's sort of bringing wisdom and rationality, I think, closer and closer together. But so key to rationality is this paying attention to the way we BS ourselves. And that, so yeah, this is where he took that shot at Stephen Hawking,
yeah.
where he's an expert in physics, but that doesn't mean he's an expert in philosophy. And we're very unwise to just assume that because somebody has an expertise in one field or are smart even, because that's another theme that comes out of this lecture. And the next one is that rationality and intelligence are not the same either. That one can be very intelligent and very irrational. So expertise is not systematic. It's limited to its domain, where rationality applies within each domain across many domains. So someone is rational if they can note self-deception when doing their daily life. So it's a general notion versus a context-specific notion. And there's a continuum. So, we have different degrees of being rational. The more systematic we can be about our methodology and approaching these things, the more rational we are. And the goal is to optimize a set of procedures to achieve the goal you want. And the upshot of that is that as you're optimizing your set of procedures, you often shift your goal. Like our goals don't necessarily stay the same. We have an initial goal. We try to figure out the best way to achieve it. And as we're doing that, often we find our goals shift. So any comments on what I've said so far? Oh, all right. So he goes into the cognitive science of rationality, and he brings up an experiment, a few experiments that seem to show that people aren't rational. So he gives the example, and I don't know, did you guys try it? Did you guys pause before hearing the answer to see if you could do it? So the example of the lily pad. So if you take a pond of water and there are lily pads growing on it, and every day the pads double, and on day 20, the entire surface of the pond is covered. Hey, Nick, how you doing? So on day 20, the entire surface of the pond was covered. And the question is, on what day was the pond half covered? And the instinct that people have is, well, day 20, it was half covered on day 10. But of course, the answer is day 19, because it doubles every day. So the day before, it would have had to have been half covered, because by day 20, it was fully covered. And I noticed in this, like, I got it right. Like, I paused as soon as he answered the question before I paused. Said, let me get the answer. I got day 19, but I noted in myself that right away upon hearing it, my instinct is they're getting at 10. Like, you're supposed to think 10. And then I thought, okay, but that's not going to be the answer. So now let me pause and think about it. And then I went through it in my mind, and then I came up with day 19. But it was interesting that,
it's kind of funny. In the chat, Concept Hut was saying that, like, it seems like wisdom is like what is unintuitive for us to go for, and I think that kind of is the case for a lot of different things, in which the intuitive sort of like response or answer to these types of things is exactly the thing that is going to be wrong. And so, like, wisdom or rationality,
that doesn't quite work, though, because with those I usually do them well, because of what he just said, because your intuition is, my first guess, the first thing that I'm going to think is going to be wrong. It's some sort of trick. So it's not going to be 10. So wisdom would actually go, your intuition would be, I'm leaning towards 10, therefore it's probably not 10. Let me think, because there's got to be a reason why I brought it up.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's kind of the thing. If you're like within a domain in which okay, here's an example of something in which people are mistakenly answering a problem, and then it presents the problem, and then that might be like, oh, okay, then my intuitive response is going to be wrong, therefore I must recalibrate and think about it a little bit more. And okay, yeah, it's actually this thing.
But what do you think all the people who did this, I mean, they're going into a psychological experiment. They probably had a similar intuition.
Possibly, because like that's what he brought up with the 9-dot problem. Even if you give people the maxim, think outside the box, that's not really something that is going to help them actually draw outside the box in order to complete the problem. So it may be the case that, and I'm not like trying to dismiss the whole psychological study there. I think the conclusion brought about by the study is probably pretty strong, that human beings respond intuitively to problems, even when the correct answer is something different from that. Like, we don't have the accurate intuitions to match the problems that we're being faced.
Well,
and it gets into
but
this
that's not
in episode
entirely
41. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, the problem there is that we're using a heuristic too rapidly, and then we're basically confining our attention on the problem. Right? We're not actually considering the variables at play, because we think we already have a proper heuristic for what the problem is presenting. So again, it's like neither a good nor a bad thing. It's certainly, learning to pay attention when dealing with certain types of problems might be the cultivation of wisdom. On the other end, stopping to think of all the variables at play is really going to hurt you if something is attacking you.
Well, and I'm failing to see the wisdom, other than the noticing that someone's about to deceive you potentially, because you're familiar with that circumstance. I'm failing to see the wisdom in a novel mathematical articulation through text. Most of us don't have wisdom machinery to engage in that circumstance.
In this example, he's just referring to rationality. So there might be other not baggage, but different associations we have with the term wisdom.
Gotcha.
Well, and I think wisdom specifically in this case would be knowing how to properly categorize problems before even going about attempting to solve them.
Well, maybe the wise action here, or thought here, would be, don't trust my initial thought. Don't trust the first thing that pops
that's
into my
exactly
head.
it.
Pause.
It's not wise in the sense of like you're better at being married and successfully raising your family. It's not wisdom in that sense. It's just, you get this type of problem. You're wise in your approach to these type of things. And yes, exactly what he just said. don't trust your initial thought because they framed it a certain way that you're led to a certain conclusion, and you know how these things work. So certain
you
type
check
of
it
person.
across multiple frames, right? You check the answer.
Yes.
And if you
exactly.
check it in multiple frames, you usually find out something's contradictory.
But you check it across multiple frames. I think I understand. If I'm understand what you mean by that correctly, you check it across multiple frames really, really quickly and intuitively. And not exactly the right way to use the word intuitive, but you've done problems like this before, and every time there's an answer that you think you're supposed to get, that you feel yourself leaning towards, that's 99 times out of 100, that's going to be the wrong answer, and half the class is going to get it wrong, and you're going to be the one to get it right. But you do that really quickly, like it's something you remember intuitively, or almost supernaturally. Like there was at one time in 7th grade when the teacher presented, because they do a lot of these problems. I've done about 500 of these over the course of my life, and they have a pattern. The pattern is the first guess is wrong. It's the thing that you automatically think is going to be wrong. So think out of the box and try to think weird, and then you're usually better at these type of things. Think weird, think about it in a weird way, and then you're better at it.
Yeah, so let's call that the shyster frame, right? And so the shyster frame is what causes you to be immediately suspicious, and then you go into the actual calculation frame. You say, well, I don't even know. These are the numbers I heard. You do the calculation and you get a result, and that's another frame. That's an actual calculation.
Right.
This is the thinking fast. And have you guys read the Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the fast thinking and the slow thinking. We have different circuits in our brains, and we have the fast thinking circuit that just jumps in, and then the slower thinking circuit that sort of slows things down. I'm not great at describing it, but the guy got a Nobel Prize is a psychologist for the work he's done, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a really good book.
Probably non-linear and linear processing at some degree.
Yeah. What's the gist of the difference? Is there
we have these practices? We're often led wrong by our initial fast thinking, but sometimes we have to think fast, right? But the slower thinking is where we can correct those errors. It's been so long.
I got you. Okay.
Well, just like with the lily pad example, okay, fast thinking is like, okay, at day 20 it was fully full. And what day was it half full? Well, what's half of 20? 10. Okay, we'll say 10. That's fast thinking, basically. And it's kind of, whereas if we were doing the slow thinking, we might take into account the thing we know about the lily pads is they double every other day or every day. And so that would be the, I guess, relevant information that we're grasping on. When within fast thinking, we're just thinking like, it's almost like a math problem. Okay, here's 20 and here's times half. So 20 times 1/2.
Yeah, you're just taking a shortcut. The shortcut could be fallacious, though.
Right.
It usually is.
Well,
the shortcut.
Well, that's the thing. If we didn't know the information about how the lily pads doubled, then it wouldn't really be fallacious. It would just be we're missing a crucial bit of information. But that's the thing. The information was included. It's just we didn't take a relevancy. We didn't take it as being relevant to the problem with our fast thinking. Whereas with slow thinking, we're kind of taking more things as being salient and using that kind of in conjunction with each other.
With the fast thinking in this particular instance, you make a cognitive mistake because you hear 20 and you hear 10 and your brain instantly makes a bias. Oh, that's really important. That's really relevant because it's half a 10. So you take a fake shortcut. It's kind of like prejudice. These 5 guys do that. Therefore, all the guys like them do that. It's the same idea. You take a shortcut to try and save yourself thinking. Say, I don't really feel like thinking about it. So let me just 10 is half of 20. It's got to be 10, right? Don't really, and you're not really doing the slow thinking where you're being careful and actually really working it out and trying to think it through. But it's a mistake. It's a cognitive shortcut you're using improperly.
And what's kind of funny is our fast thinking and our slow thinking is tied to what is salient to us. So there's this other example of, say, you put like half of people that are smokers and half people that are non-smokers into a room in order to sort of like test the validity of scientific papers on the risk of cancer due to smoking. And like the papers themselves were like flawed in multiple ways, but the people that were able to recognize the flaws are the smokers, because the smokers, this is highly relevant to them. If it is the case that smoking definitely causes cancer, and there's like incontrovertible, I mean, I think the exact example that I'm referring to had to do with like coffee drinking leading to breast cancer, and the people that were best at finding the problems with the study were women coffee drinkers. And so that's kind of the thing, like our fast thinking and our slow thinking is directly tied to what we find relevant as our kind of agent arena relationship.
It's
like
what details leap out to you as important. And sometimes you take fake shortcuts. 20's half of 10. It's got to be 10. And your brain kind of routes towards the shortcut automatically. Usually, sometimes it's good, but a lot of times it can lead you into stupid thinking. Stupid.
It's an insight that you have, but again, that same insights can lead you in a great direction, or it can lead you astray.
But I think we're slightly focusing on a. It's not as if the problem of the lily pad problem is any slower figuring out that it's 19, right? So what it seems to have to do with, right, you're still using a quick processor. What it seems to have to do with is how our brain is picking out relevant information almost a priori, right? If you're honed again, right, where when we heard it, we knew that it was supposed to have some aspect of a trick. And so the brain, my brain at least, automatically picked up on how to split, where to apply the algorithm of having. So 19 popped into my head extremely rapidly, right? It wasn't like I had to counter myself from the 10 that I calculated initially. It was as if I knew what to look for, therefore it was much quicker to process. But that's
but you're probably
the
rare.
training of wisdom.
That's probably rare.
Maybe
your experience is rare because
maybe.
you're probably quicker, smarter than most people. Honestly, you probably made calculations a priori, but you factored them almost so rapid fire that you didn't even notice you processed them. That's my guess. Like I
had to slow it down.
well, I think kind of the point I was making a little bit earlier is
2 lily pad. I got on my pen and paper. It was like a lily pad is red.
Drew out each lily pad every day. Okay, so day 1 we have 1 lily pad. Day
it took
20,
me 20 days.
I gotta fill.
I had a pool. T Converted Man would have a pool with his lily pads.
The point that I was making earlier, and I think Nick might be agreeing with, is that the context in which we're analyzing a problem is there for the lily pad problem, whereas most problems in life don't really have the context behind them to tell us whether, okay, our intuitive notion is going to be inaccurate or our intuitive notion is going to be accurate, something like that. It's like we don't have the framing for most problems, and like part of problem solving is figuring out, okay, what is the frame to this, and then does that help me kind of like figure out the problem?
And it's also important, I note, it's also important to note, I think, that often, right, this kind of gets into the something we've talked about before, but the way in which we ask a question seems to matter far more than the answer we come up with to the question. And that's because the frame is often directly implied in how we ask the question in the first place.
Totally. 100 times out of 100. That's one of the biggest things in like what we deal with like apologetics and stuff. How you frame a problem to yourself can produce the answer that you say is coming organically.
The obvious,
and it isn't.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's what they get into in episode 41 in the criticisms of this model, or of the conclusion, is that there's 2 different ways in which we make mistakes in these things. One is we understand the problem correctly, and we make a cognitive error in how we solve it, or two is there's some initial miscommunication. But based on that initial miscommunication, we solve it correctly. Like once you start from there.
Right.
And,
yeah. Like it might be the case that the person, when they were being told the lily pad problem, they weren't tracking that that first part of the information about like the lily pads, they'll double every day.
They may have missed some of it. They may have missed some of it and didn't quite catch the significance of it.
Right. Yeah. And in that sense, it's almost like it is very much about they're not catching that this is a significant problem here, or this is a significant feature to the problem.
Mm-hmm. But what do you guys think? The next one's really interesting too. The next experiment, where this is a little bit different. This is where they gave people two situations, and so first they found a proposition that they agreed with, that they strongly agreed with or strongly disagreed with. Then they gave them two situations. One was a good, logically valid argument that leads to the opposite conclusion, and the other was a bad, poorly constructed argument that led to their conclusion. And they asked them which one of them was the good argument, and overwhelmingly, or at least reliably, it says people would pick the bad argument, that they failed at what Vervaeke called critical detachment, that they weren't able to separate the answer from the process of getting to the answer. They just saw their preferred position, and they went with that, even if the way the argument was structured was
totally
bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one aspect to this, like in Vervaeke's kind of I guess analysis of like whether human beings are rational or not, there's another, I guess, sort of position that I kind of wish he would have gone into, but maybe it's not like really in the literature much. But at least from my reading of Nassim Taleb, he seems to hold to the position that human beings are irrational, but in a sort of rational way. It's not that we're always or logically rational, or even like very capable of kind of solving these types of problems, but rather we're more focused on what is relevant to us, and then for the things that aren't relevant to us, we're not going to kind of put in our slow thinking. And so I think there's a way in which maybe there's a way to interpret that sort of cognitive biases that are being played there, where like obviously it is the case that they're going with the logically invalid argument that still leads to their conclusion. And the reason they might be doing so is because their interpretation of what a good argument is something that leads to a good conclusion. And so because they hold the conclusion to be good, the argument that leads to it would be good in a sort of way.
Right. But then I guess if we're holding rationality is being on guard or taking steps to avoid self-deception, that would be the opposite of that. So it would be irrational.
Yeah. Using that as our standpoint for rationality. But I think there's ways in which we can be rational in way that we don't even realize. Let me see.
What?
Yeah, go.
Can I
go
help
ahead,
you?
Craig. Yeah.
I think what you're getting at is that people are irrational. They take cognitive shortcuts that don't necessarily work out in their favor. But there's a perfectly valid explanation why humans behave that way. And there's a perfectly valid explanation why people do it a lot and consistently and collectively over long periods of time.
Right.
It serves some interest that we aren't aware of.
So similar to the Tyler's example. You did. Thank you, Craig.
Okay.
Similar to Tyler's example of the crossing the road both ways. Like if the road is clear and you don't look both ways, you could say that was almost like a wasteful expenditure of energy because you weren't going to get hit. But it may be the case that by building up that habit of looking both ways before crossing the street, even when it's obvious that there's no car, like it's 4 a.m. at night, there's not going to be any cars passing by. You would definitely see it well beforehand. Like looking both ways is almost a irrational thing to do. but because it's instilled in habit, and that's the thing, like most of these things we're responding to via our habit, that it's still rational in a sense, because in the multiple possible worlds in which we exhibit this behavior, it still leads to some sort of beneficial outcome for ourselves. And so like,
except when you get run over because you didn't notice the car. Yeah.
well, no. Like the irrational behavior in that example was looking both ways, just because it's I'll take an actual irrational behavior of like the appeal to authority fallacy. Like that is fallacious because like just because somebody that we trust says something that doesn't mean that what they said is true, but it's still reasonable, I guess, for us to trust it, even though we're appealing to like we're making a fallacy.
It's a protective reflex.
No, wait, hold on. Sorry. Just on the appeal to authority fallacy, it's not fallacious to appeal to authority in their area of authority. It's fallacious where, like the Stephen Hawking example, when you appeal to Stephen Hawking on philosophy, that's fallacious appeal to authority. Just because he's an expert in physics, like it's reasonable to say, hey, Stephen Hawking said this, you know what, that's a pretty good bet. It's he's on the money, or at least a lot more than I would be. But suddenly when he's talking about philosophy outside of his expertise, that's where it's fallacious. So
sorry, Nick, I didn't let you in sooner. I don't know why it doesn't, like, it gave me the doorbell earlier in the stream before we even started, but I think like when we're live, maybe it doesn't actually do the doorbell sound. Yeah, but yeah, welcome back, Nick. So the appeal to authority, like even when making a fallacious appeal to authority, there might still be a rational basis for that, where in most circumstances, appealing to somebody that's wise in one domain, it's reasonable to assume that they're also wise in some other domain, even though in certain circumstances, it's not going to be wise because they're like completely inadequate in that other domain.
It's a totally, most of the time, that's actually a very useful heuristic, because the authority, even if the authority is wrong, you are self-protecting if you agree with authority and covering your tracks. So it's an actual completely rational behavior, but sometimes it works against you. But it's really rational because the authority is impressive and he's impressed upon you. He's an authority. So even if you don't know what you're talking about and you yield to the authority, you keep yourself safe.
Yeah, it provides you a justification for, like, if somebody like, oh, hey, why did you go with this situation? Oh,
the smart guy said it.
Yeah,
the doctor said.
Yeah, and so you're giving yourself an out there, and like sometimes that's why we do things. It's just so that we can have that out that we can rely upon.
Okay, so then we're changing it, right? So then it's not. It's reasonable to do it because we want to protect our ass rather than because we're trying to get to the truth of the situation there. So we've sort of, but maybe we should ask first, do we agree that to be rational means to be taking steps to avoid self-deception or to overcome self-deception? Because it seems I'm getting the sense that some of you don't agree quite with that.
I think if we're using that as our definition, then I think there could be a reasonable case to say that human beings are not rational in that sense. If we're instead maybe
just so you know, like in 41 they go against this. They're saying these experiments don't quite show we're not rational.
Right. There's another way in which you can consider rationality as sort of not to do with self-deception, but more to do with making, I guess, this might actually lead into Vervaeke still somewhat. Making mistakes. Okay. Rationality is not making lethal mistakes. That might be a almost Nassim Taleb or a Darwinian definition of rationality. Whereas self-deception is like avoiding any sorts of mistakes, and the Darwinian notion is only worrying about the lethal mistakes.
Right, whereas siding with the authority is a way of avoiding lethal mistakes. That's a really good idea most of the time. You know, you're protecting yourself to a degree from harm. You know, I can think of a real world example. One time we were crossing the border to Canada, and I was with my friend from college who was very different than me. Like back then I was really like boozy, like punk rock. And we were crossing the border and he starts talking to the police officer. He was like really good student, you know, top of the honor. And he starts going like, yes, sir, no, sir. And I endlessly derided him for being so like subservient to the cop. And then I realized like 5 years later that he was completely right. And that was a much smarter way to be around police officers.
Because if you started like mouthing off to the police officer in that instance, then you would have been like...
You would have been in trouble. And that happened to me a few times over the years. And I was like, wait a minute, my friend was right. I was the dumb one. You know, his behavior was correct. It's wiser, it's smarter, you know?
Right. And I want to point out that Vervaeke's notion of rationality is something highly important and something that we ought to be striving for. But I think kind of like later on, I think he talks about like we're holding people to a certain standard that is like unreasonable to sort of hold them to.
Well, it's unreasonable if it's outside of our competence.
Right. Yeah. And
so
I think in other
is
instances,
it outside of our... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's also unreasonable in certain circumstances to hold them to a level of rationality that is non-viable for most situations.
Wait, why? Why can't it? Why? Wait, how do we define? You mean maybe less convenient, but that's not. But how is it non-viable?
Well, I mean, for a lot of situations, we don't have the tools of getting to what the truth is. And so, like, you go one way or the other, you're going to be doing so on a basis of uncertain knowledge or limited knowledge. And so, if you're going to be making some sort of mistake, it's better to make the mistake that won't get you killed. Or, and like, getting killed is kind of the far end of the extreme there. But it may be better to get... If you know that you have a high chance of making a mistake, it's better to make the mistake in which you have some sort of out or justification.
It's better to make the mistake that the authority figure, just because you yielded to the authority guy, than to make a mistake on your own and then you're left.
Yeah, but I think you guys are just getting into more nuanced cases.
Yeah, we are. I was realizing.
I don't think they go against what he's saying. It's just he's picked some very simple examples to make the point, but
we're
talking about things where there's a lot more things to take into account.
This might not even
have to weigh it, and
this might not even be accurate to label as a rationality. It may be something else like evolutionarily practical wisdom.
No, but it's also but it's the same. Like the guy at the police checkpoint who knows, especially if he's black, for example. And he knows that if he's going to mouth off to the cop, there's a good chance he could get shot. Right. Is being wise and rational in just kowtowing and saying yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, no sir.
Yeah, even if the police officer lies or makes a mistake about something, it may be wise in that instance to go along with that mistake as if it actually did happen, even though we, from our perspective, know that it certainly didn't.
Right. So I think that's still in concert with what Vervaeke's saying. It's just a more nuanced example.
Sure.
Here, like for example, the self-deception would be I can just say whatever I want and everything will be okay. Mm. Some people we're white, we have a much better chance of getting out of a situation with mouthing off to a police officer, say, than a black person would. So,
yeah, but you'll still get in trouble. You'll still be made an example of, even as you'll still get yourself in more trouble than you
right.
probably would have gotten into if you just kept your mouth shut.
Yeah. So the issue there in terms of authority isn't authority in terms of are they the appeal to authority is really about just saying I accept X is true just because this person who I see as an authority said it. So rather than having thought through it ourselves.
If I can perhaps try and generalize this, would it be that we can keep some idea of humans as rational because the a priori framework that we are using is that we're human? So even in the case of the Lily example, when we are responding, we're not calculating for the problem. We're calculating for the social interaction we are having with the person we are communicating with. Or, right? we're
would say-
always bringing variables into our calculation that have to do with being a person. And
Right.
that's part of the rational calculation.
I would
that
say
we're-
yielding to self-interest most often. That's what's going on. That's where I'm calling it rational, because you're not necessarily yielding to logic, you're yielding to self-interest. And it's not quite so obvious how you're doing that, but that's usually what's going on.
Sure.
There's calculations going on of like that are really, really actually rational calculations, but they're going on underneath the surface, and they you can always catch them on the surface. Just very similar to what you said. It's just
Yeah, it's
clarifying.
funny. Like Vervaeke gets into exactly that of like. Actually, as I was going through, I didn't quite understand his connection that he was, or like his reasoning to get there. But he was saying something like, let me see, our standard for rationality has to be within us. Like the standard is created by us, and then it has to be something in which we're capable of acting out upon. Whereas I think like if like it certainly would be the case that like if we were giving the problem to a robot, we gave them all the information, the robot would be able to answer the problem correctly every single time. And then if we're like applying that same level of rationality to humans, then we're almost the ones making the mistake, because we're presuming a level of rationality that is not it's not that it's not accessible. It's something that is not like upright or like first
It's not first impulse in most people.
or
Most people have
highest in
other
priority.
considerations.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's almost like the person presenting the problem is making a mistake in expecting the person to respond like a robot rather than responding
Right,
like
a
human.
human being, where there's a whole hierarchy of things going on. And
Yes.
I mean, I think the answer to this, I mean, it comes in 41, where he talks about multiple competencies, and that we have to think of it not as just, first of all, there's a scale. There's a scale of rationality. You know, we can get better at rationality. We can practice it, and we can learn. But also part of the problem is that they were assuming there was just a single competence. But sometimes we have multiple competencies, and they sometimes conflict with one another. So I think that's sort of the different ways of thinking about the problem. Is, you know, they were thinking of the problem of dividing it by 2. And so once you start with that, you know, half is divided by 2. So 20 divided by 2.
Mhm.
So but they were wrong, but because they were conflicting, they didn't quite understand, I don't know, probability
Right.
theory or
Isn't
whatnot.
there similar experiments where they either slightly change the wording or change the presentation, and then the error rate goes down enormously? For example, I would imagine if you had written that problem out and put it on a test, most people would get it correct. But perhaps in a verbal form where they're interacting with a person face to face,
Well, I don't know. We haven't
level
been told if
probably
it was
drops.
verbal or written. We don't know if it was verbal
Yeah.
or written.
Well,
right?
I can just
Sure,
imagine
but-
like the medium is the message, and so like if you
Yeah.
present the problem in such a way in which like the solution is almost like obvious, like if you emboldened the text in which it says lily pads double every day, then it would seem like, okay, that's an important piece of information there. Now I can answer 19 every time, basically. But yeah, and that might be kind of the thing, is like when
I'm
we're
saying they definitely have done these experiments where they change variables to focus the person's attention more on certain bits of information than others, and play around with this idea of, you know, the
yeah, totally.
Right.
method is the message.
You can tweak it easily to get more correct answers by
Yes.
just doing what John just said, doing some shift and making some detail a little bit more salient, you know, making it
Exactly.
in big black letters, you know.
Yeah.
So again, what they're calculating is not rationality. What they're calculating is where the person's attention is focused in solving the problem. And that's a big difference.
That's interesting. So like if you present a problem to somebody, it's not that they're going to respond with the correct answer, but they're going to respond with the, like, what people are most consider as being most highest in priority to them.
Yeah, but
Yes.
but wait, I mean, Sure, but I mean, isn't that part of being rational? That if we're highlighting on the wrong salient points, then we're not being rational.
Right. And I think that's actually a point in which Vervaeke's definition of rationality, and even like Nassim Taleb's definition of rationality, and who thinks that human beings are irrationally irrational, could converge in that it's due to what they find relevant, or like having your relevancy tester working properly and finding certain things relevant or certain things unrelevant or irrelevant.
It's hard to make the judgment of if their salience was wrong without more information of exactly how the test was conducted. So if you're creating an expectation of fluidity of communication, then their salience was properly trained. It just produced the wrong answer for the specific question, but it may have been the right answer to keep a fluid dynamic moving between the conversation.
Right. Yeah, because that's the thing.
Again,
If like
it's hard
somebody
to
asks,
judge
if somebody asks you a question, we're so used to the dialogical kind of pacing, and so if you respond, okay, like
yes,
I present the problem to you, and then you're like,
if you say I will punish you if you get this wrong, now you're probably going to get a much higher correct percentage, because the person's attention again focuses in on a whole different set of salience.
Like when they're saying
calculations.
when they were concluding that people are not rational, they weren't saying people don't have the capacity to be rational. They were just saying in that instance they weren't acting rational, and in many instances we don't.
Again, that's the wrong frame for it. Well, it might be right, but without more information of how the test was conducted, we can't make a decision over whether it was rational or not.
Right, and I think that's what they say in 41. I think that's the point that it was made in 41, that we don't know how they understood it, or how they understood they may have misunderstood certain parts of the question, and it's very difficult to suss out from just those experiments, which reason they made the mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Which problem is being solved?
Well,
right? Again, is it communication, or is it this literal math problem?
Well, there's other types of problems that are very similar that people will reliably get wrong. Like there's a whole kind of Bayesian problem of like, okay, here's the information I give you about a woman. She went to a liberal arts college. She's a banker, she has interest in finance, and she voted for Hillary, something like that. Now I give you these two responses. Is she a banker, or is she a banker and is she a feminist? And then people will say, oh, well, she's probably a banker and a feminist. But the thing is, there's a much smaller subsection of bankers and feminists than there are of just bankers. And so you have a higher probability that the information I gave you about this woman is that she's a banker, then she's this even smaller niche.
It doesn't even matter any of the details. No matter how obvious it is, you can literally say she's a banker and a feminist.
Yeah, because that's the thing.
That she's a banker, or that she's a banker and a feminist.
Yeah, just by including feminists to that, you're making the response smaller. Like, and just by saying, okay, she's a banker, you have a much higher probability of that being accurate. But that's the thing. Like, because of our verbal acuity, because we're given this information about a woman, we're led to believe that certain things about the woman.
Yeah. Well, and again, we are front loading, right? Again, the a priori framework has a lot more to do with how we conduct social communication than it has to do with solving probabilistic problems.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Probabilistic problems are contained in the set of being a human, but it's calculating for a lot of other variables, not immediately obvious when we try and relate these experiments in. Yeah.
So I think like the conclusion that you can make is that humans don't react to things and carry all information as being salient. Like it is the case that people will discredit information that is given to us, and then
Yeah,
raise in importance other information.
It's an interesting, especially the lily pad. It's an interesting experiment. I don't know if it tells us anything about rationality per se, but it definitely tells us something that you can set up a problem where because 10 is half of 20, immediately most people jump to that as the solution mechanism, and it's hard for them to get off it. And that teaches us something about people. One of the things that I think will be really, really interesting, because if you put this out in the real world, this is just an observation, but when I thought about this problem, oftentimes people get the wrong answer in the real world at this, and they don't know that they're walking around with the wrong answer. And then there's a whole group of people who say, yeah, it's 10 days. And they all get together and they have the same cognitive shortcut that they all used. And they all think they're right. And they never really look at the problem in any way. And now they have an interest group and they all got it wrong. And this is how the world gets built up the way it is, with all the like competing interests, and some of them are just totally wrong.
Craig, I take it you've been talking with some flat earthers lately.
There's a lot of different.
Exactly. And they reinforce each other's whatever. I don't even know how they're justifying. I've never really listened to them enough to understand what the process is. But there's some sort of weird thing going on where they're cherry picking. This is more relevant than these 100 details. And they're all reinforcing it amongst each other, right?
Well, yeah. It's like they're placing a higher priority in their own sense experience of like, okay, I'm walking about and it doesn't feel like the world is turning. Everything feels very stable. And they're discrediting the salience of, say, big government corporation NASA is telling me these certain things. And I know from past experiences that big corporations and big government tend to lie to the people. And so, maybe I'm making a valid inference here and thinking that NASA is lying to me, the people. And so I'm placing a higher priority on
right. And
my own
then they
intuitions.
get together with 100 people who do the exact same thing, and they reinforce. I'm assuming they all reinforce it amongst each other.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the thing, is like, to this whole group of people, it's just pointing out how irrelevant the shape of the earth actually is to them. Whereas, like, if somebody was working for NASA, the shape of the earth is something highly relevant in order to not get fired from your job. Or if you're like some sort of geologist or science teacher or something like that, these are all pretty relevant things that you need to know in order to actually live as a human being.
Yeah, totally. In order to have any type of...
I want to add another layer here, which is that this becomes almost a mockery of the actual problem when we are dealing with complicated problems, right? So if it's complicated, then we generally will give it to people that can handle the complicated nature of the problem. Where this entire thing totally falls apart is when we try and confront complex problems.
Right.
Because now you have literally no other mechanism than salience manipulation. There is no way to come up with a good answer then.
This is what he brings in with active open-mindedness. This is near the end of 41, where he says this is the missing piece for Stanovich, who's one of the researchers of rationality. So he starts off by saying, intelligence is not equal to rationality, because when they do these tests, they find intelligence only matches up to rationality at 0.3. So that's out of 1. So I guess there's like 70% of the time intelligence. I'm not sure quite what it means, but there's a 0.3 concordance between intelligence and rationality. So what accounts for most of the variance? And he argues that so it's a mix of cognitive style, bad mindware, so software, mindware, sort of our mental programs, and psychotechnology. So we can use poor techniques. I think that's what he's saying. The appropriate cognitive style, something you can learn, a sense of sensitivities and skills. So again, you can get better at these problems as you go along. But active open-mindedness is this training yourself to look for these patterns of self-deception, looking for biases. So for example, in the simple of the lily pad, the people who answered 10 are very quickly coming to that answer, probably, and they're not slowing down to say, where could I be being deceived here? What else should I be looking at? And that so that if you're, talk about the flat earthers, I think do a lot of confirmation bias. They don't spend a lot of time saying, where could I be wrong? And act, but not just saying, where could I be wrong, then actively going out and trying to identify where they're wrong. So that if you're not doing that, if you're not actively trying to figure out where you could be wrong, if you're not actively testing yourself that way, you're probably not being rational. You're probably being too quick about it and irrational. What do you
Certainly.
guys think?
And a great example of that specific thing is generally we can only see extremely long distances over extremely flat surfaces, which is usually water, right? And one of the confirmation bits that gets reconfirmed in these circles is that when people look out over long distances of water, and they look at a structure that they know is, however tall, the curvature of the earth is not making up for the amount removed from the horizon of that distant figure. So, for example, I've seen it here in my town because of the shape of the bay here. You can see Monterey over a vast stretch of water. So people will go to some point, look out over the ocean, and then, with some type of telescope or something that can magnify properly, they'll look at a building in Monterey and go, look, that building is too high for how far away Monterey is from this point. Now, what they're missing is that because the air density above water is generally lower than it is above land, except for in certain circumstances, and this is because you have heat bouncing off of water much differently than it does off of land, you can actually get a mirage where light bends for that curvature. And so you can actually make up the difference of the height of the building because the light itself is curving along with this change in density along the, right? It's the same effect that when we see this liquidy effect looking out over desert roads, same thing. It's this distortion in density of air that creates a mirage.
It's almost like these two factors where if we don't recognize that there's a second factor, when we look to the problem, we're seeing what we're like hoping to see.
Yes.
Then that like confirms our hypothesis. Oh,
yes.
It really is flat. Oh my God, I've been lied to.
And we're throwing away the complexity of the situation in order to have our confirmation bias.
Well, yeah, I mean, the world is combinatorially explosive. Like we can't fit all of the complexities to life within our living. Like we have very limited mammalian brains, and so there's a lot of things in which we kind of have to throw out. And for the flat earthers, all these extra bits are something that is kind of unnecessary, really.
So that's one layer too. So this is interesting. Maybe I might be going off on a rabbit hole here.
That's fine.
So there's under complexity, which is that situation. There's also over complexity, which is that you literally can compress all of the information of a three-dimensional object into 2 dimensions.
Are you going into the what is it, Leonard Susskind, the holographic principle, or are you going into something else? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, that's certainly one form of it. Yes, that is absolutely one form of it, right? The black hole issue where you can calculate the total entropy inside of a black hole as a product of a quarter of its surface area. Which is what the holographic principle is based on. But yes, right, this is mathematically possible. So you literally could create a picture of the world as a 2-dimensional surface, and it would be totally accurate. 100% accurate.
Yeah,
right?
There's kind of the joke that I have that since if the holographic principle is true, then the flat earthers are right, but not in the way that they think they are.
No, they're right. I knew they were right.
To describe it this way, you need an insanely large amount of complexity that's not present in the 3-dimensional model, right? It's far simpler to describe the behavior on our planet in 3-dimensional terms than it is to do it in 2-dimensional terms and preserve all of the information.
Yeah,
right?
that's the other thing.
So-
Like what Donald Hoffman, he kind of like presents this theory of cognition where spatial terms are evolutionary heuristics we have in order to determine like how much energy do we have to expend in order to reach this distance. And like there was even like tests, like if you give people a certain amount of glucose in their system or maybe sucrose, something that gave them more energy, how they would measure distance by sight would change between the people that have less energy and those that have more. Like, oh, that looks like a shorter distance, which is kind of strange, but especially because he like well, I don't want to say over extrapolates, because he's using the holographic principle as well to sort of hold to the fact that the world exists two-dimensionally rather than three-dimensionally. He extrapolates this even further to point out like all of our spatial cognition is evolutionarily derived, and it can be kind of, and like for this reason it sort of presents a I guess a problem for us, and like maybe we shouldn't hold to our natural intuitions about what we see in front of us is automatically real.
Sure.
Something like that.
Well, okay. And finally, one last interesting example, because it's fun and I like this. But right, it took general relativity to prove that we are not a heliocentric solar system. Right? So we went from Earth is center of the universe, which was wrong, but not wrong. Right? It was just massively too simple. Then we go to the heliocentric solar system, and everything suddenly makes sense. But that model is entirely wrong. It's a fiction. We made it up to simplify the problem to make far better sense of what we saw occurring. But right, the orbit of Mercury is not explained in the heliocentric universe using Newtonian physics. So then, right, we go from Earth as the center of the universe to heliocentric model. Finally, we get to Einstein, who says, no, it will change, right? But you have to define the frame of reference from which you're looking at it, and it will adapt to that frame of reference. But each of those frames of reference is just describing a true model of the universe, which means for us here on Earth, the Earth-centric model is actually the most accurate.
Well, it's like accurate to the model, I guess, rather than like no matter which like nexus point you have for the universe of like where do things orbit, you can't like really place it that point anywhere. And so by, I guess, placing it on Earth, I'm not sure I'm exactly getting your point.
So okay, let's just explain a little bit of the complexity. With the heliocentric model, we can describe the motion of the planets with a vast degree of accuracy using Euclidean geometry and really simple algebraic formulas. In order to jump the shark into general relativity, we have to create an insane, right, analytic geometry, calculus blended with geometry. Not to mention all these crazy, Lorentz transformations, right? Well, that's special relativity. So it's enormously more complex to calculate how the solar system is functioning from a Earth-centric model and to actually keep all the information. General relativity allows us to do that, right? It's possible to make those calculations. It's so much more complex than this heliocentric model that we had with Newton, and certainly, many orders of magnitude more complex than whatever humans were thinking when they thought the Earth was the center of the universe originally.
Okay, so yeah, okay, I think I'm getting it. So like the previous model was like the Earth is our stable point. And from that stable point, we have the sun going around and the moon going around and things like that. That was wrong. Now we switched over to, okay, the sun is the stable point. And now we have the Earth going around, the moon goes around that, and then the other planets go around the sun. But we realize that, okay, that doesn't really work either, because the sun itself is in motion and it's like rotating around, I don't know, say like
Not even the sun itself is in motion, actually. It was just straight up wrong. So when we looked at Mercury, right, Mercury is the classic example because it was noticeably wrong before we had, special or general relativity. But it was wrong by minute scales. We needed very fancy telescopes in order to be able to figure out that it was wrong. But it literally was unexplainable how Mercury was moving within Newtonian physics.
So like any point in which we try to like localize a stability or orbit, or like where things orbit around, doesn't work exactly, or
it does. It's just that what general relativity tells us is that you can arbitrarily pick any point and describe the rest of the motion from that point. But you have to say, I'm looking at it from here.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the other point I wanted to get into a little bit earlier. Just
Guys, I gotta go.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Chris. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, that's all right. No, I had to leave at like eight-ish. So I gotta jet. Wife will be home any minute. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Okay. The other point I wanted to get into is like, it's almost like, well, it is the case that our cognition is like socially derived, not just like we have our individual cognition, but we also have like, okay, I realize that sometimes I'm wrong. And so I have to like test these things out with other people as well. Like, hey, does this seem to map well with you? And like, yeah, that seems to work. Okay, that gives me more confidence in my beliefs here. But the thing is, we can self-select which people we're like socially confirming our intuitions on, to the point that the entire kind of social cognitorial, the social cognition that's going on is itself like undergoing some sort of self-deception there. And so it's almost like, well, it is.
But that's why we also talk about risk, right? So we're not guaranteeing. So when you confirm with somebody else, you are being more rational than not doing it, because it lowers your risk of being wrong, but it doesn't eliminate your risk of being wrong.
Yeah, and there's almost like a secondary aspect to social cognition is confirming your biases, or not confirming your biases, but checking your biases against people that disagree with you. And so like, if it's something that they still will say, no, that's a good bias to kind of have, or not a bias, but no, you're accurate in that one position here. It's like, okay, he normally disagrees with me, so that kind of gives me a good case to make for why this is actually something rational to hold to.
That's why we should say that being in a why am I blanking on the term where everyone being like in a circle
groupthink
is irrational. You want to have it's much more rational to be in a mixed group with people with different ideas who can check each other.
And like different temperaments too. Like if you have somebody that's higher in agreeableness, they might be able to better coordinate differing ideas that seem like they're just semantically not semantic. Well, I guess semantically different, verbally different from one another. Someone high in agreeableness might be able to converge those into a unified idea. And if you have people that are higher in disagreeableness, then you'll be able to have people ways in which to go up against strong ideas. Like people that are libertarians, they're more likely to be higher in disagreeableness, and so they're the ones that are able to go against the crowd even when like social shaming has no effect on them. And so by having this wide variety of temperaments can be very helpful in having sort of a successful social cognition taking place.
Yes, but you need a metagame where all of them can actually contribute in a way that doesn't blow apart the in-group that you formed.
Yeah, that's kind of the libertarian problem, is that any sort of a difference in opinion or something like that, it's just going to diverge into another class of libertarians. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I'm not a libertarian. Or there's a lot of different ways in which to kind of break up,
Well,
break away from
you
others.
infinitely divide back into the individual.
Concept had found a nice screenshot of our debate there.
That's good.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah. Thanks, Concept Hut.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Echo chamber. That's right. Echo chamber. That's what I was looking for.
That's it. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Concept Hut.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the I guess sort of problem is trying to find a way in which to have disagreeable people, or it's not just disagreeable people, it's having a social cognitive corrective mechanism that isn't just an echo chamber, but it's also one that can be able to go here with one another and to build up off of. It's almost like a Gordian knot that we're trying to.
And again, freaking Peterson's on the edge of order and chaos again comes in, that optimal point of growth where in a sense you're pushing the very boundary of what allows the group to remain a group, while allowing the largest freedom of motion within that boundary, kind of like, and allowing it to grow.
Tying to Vervaeke's zone of proximal development within
yes,
God,
exactly.
What is it? It's the flow state. That's it. Yeah. So like having a communal flow state that can occur.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Well, we talked about active open-mindedness. So that word active, like a lot of people say, oh, I'm open-minded, but what do you do to be open-minded? I think open-minded is more than just being open to other ideas. It's taking steps to make sure that you're open to other ideas, that you're checking yourself. And so we should be all welcoming. A lot of people take criticism very badly, but we should be welcoming this criticism, as long as it's constructive.
Yeah, there's this
that's the
Stoic there's a Stoic quote about accepting criticism that, like, okay, if the person is lying, then I have no reason to care about it because there's a lie that somebody's telling about me that just doesn't hold water. Like it doesn't matter that they're telling this lie about me. But if they're telling me the truth, then they're giving me an avenue in which I can correct myself. And so I that's why it's good to listen to all forms of criticism, because there's no way in which it can really hurt you. And that's kind of like the Stoic kind of psychotechnology that they use in order to correct this natural inclination to hate any sort of criticism.
What was the first part? If they're lying, what?
If they're lying, then their criticism doesn't really matter because it's not accurately portraying truth. And so, like, if people are,
okay,
I don't remember.
But what if I don't know they're lying and then I take it to heart and it ruins me? Yeah.
Oh well,
or you get lost in self-reflective, the self-reflectiveness gap, right? You end up questioning yourself endlessly based on trying to figure out whether their criticism was a lie or not, right?
Yeah, that might be a further elaboration. I think that the point of it was only to we should always be open to accept criticism, because even if it's a lie, it won't matter to me. But if it's true, then it could be very useful to me. And so that's why.
On what you were saying, Nick, Vervaeke talks about Barron's research, and he says you can't overdo this or you're going to choke on the combinatory explosion. So you want to do this questioning to the right degree. And this becomes more nebulous, but this is where wisdom comes in. So, finding that optimal grip of how far do we go and checking ourselves before we have to act, and, not getting stuck in this, in a loop of, indecision.
Yeah. All right. Do we want to go on? There was another point with the, I guess, Euthyphro dilemma that we might go into. I don't know. I almost kind of want to stop there. Well, we'll go into the Euthyphro dilemma, and then maybe we'll stop there, because I think we got a lot out there, and I don't want to overexert ourselves. I'm already kind of feeling a little bit of the dampening of being able to articulate myself. But there's a sort of point of confusion. So the reason he brought up the Euthyphro dilemma was to do with the standard that we're setting for rationality. If we're like, if by us saying that humans are irrational, we might be like setting a standard that doesn't even make sense to apply to them. So like, yes, it is the case that humans cannot
a rational.
Right. Yeah. Like, and kind of like what I was saying earlier, like it might be better to hold a robot to a certain set of standard in which they cannot think of, they cannot differentiate unsalient information. Like they take all information as if it is pertinently salient to all other pieces of information. So the fact about the lily pads directly correlates to how every day it doubles and what day it was, and yeah, all that together as one thing, whereas humans will kind of segment what is most salient and then they'll focus on those things. So half, 20, 10. There we go. So it may be the case that we're expecting people to be rational when we sort of like have no basis for doing for holding them to that standard. And so the let's see, how do you get from there to the Euthyphro dilemma? It was what we call something irrational. Why should we expect us to be rational, and how is it that we're not meeting the standard?
Well, you're saying if we're following standards just because we've been commanded to do so, it's not really a rational act. We're just giving into authority. If we're following the standard because we acknowledge they are good and right, then we already possess the knowledge.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that was that, like the reason to do something has to be good in and of itself, rather than we're doing it just because somebody else. Like if it was a case that God commanded us to do an act, but the act itself wasn't good, then God himself wouldn't be good, and so like we shouldn't listen to him. But if God tells us to do an act because the act itself is good, then that indicates that, well, the act is good in and of itself, independent of
and
God's
we have to figure that out
to do that thing.
Yeah, and if we can only follow it if we're competent to figure that out.
Right. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like if we have no method of knowing whether something, let's say something is true, or like we don't have any absolute certainty confirmation point in knowing whether a thing is true, then we can't like expect us to act upon that thing with that sort of knowledge. Like it may very well be the case that this was true, and so we should do this certain thing, but we don't have access to knowing that it's true. That is, ought implies can. That was the point he was sort of making as well. So there's two kind of features that he, I guess, concludes with: that people have to be the source of the standard for rationality, and we also have to be capable of living up to those standards for rationality. And the point that kind of didn't make much sense to me is, if people themselves are the standard for rationality, that seems to directly contradict his usage of the Euthyphro dilemma there, because for Plato himself, the reason the act is good is because it reflects goodness itself in an objective way. It's not the person themselves kind of putting that, almost like him saying the standard for rationality has to be provided by us. Like we are the standard makers. But that seems to directly fall into the Euthyphro dilemma, because like if an act is good simply because a God says it's good, then that God is the standard maker for the thing itself, and the thing itself isn't good itself.
No, I think he meant more that reason. So the reason comes from us. So in figuring it out, that if we're just taking it from fiat, then we're not using reason. So when we figure things out, we're the source, but it doesn't mean we haven't figured it out in an objective way. It means we're the source in that it comes from our cognitive processes.
Well, it seems like he's saying that we set the
slippery
standard.
slope there, because, well, okay, So if we go with purely rational, then again we have to like argue against a hard form of eugenics. Like
Well,
it is rational to seek the right superiority of our genome to advance our species and to, you know, offer the most to our children. So again, right, where are we making the judgment where right there's this calculation we are doing between the good and the rational, where they do not directly necessarily overlap each other.
We're not talking about morality, so to speak. We're talking about reason here.
Right. Yeah. So he was using the Euthyphro dilemma as sort of an analogy to what rationality is. So instead of saying a thing is good simply because God commands it, a thing is reasonable simply because some reasonable person declares it to be so. Well, if so following the conclusion to the Euthyphro dilemma, well, if the thing is reasonable to do, then it's reasonable to do independent of the reasonable person declaring it to be reasonable. So that would be like the direct matchup between the Euthyphro dilemma and rationality, which is why I was confused by him saying that people are the ones that are setting the standards for what rationality is, because it seems like if people are the ones setting the standard, that's almost arbitrary in a sense.
Well, because he said to be irrational is to acknowledge and follow a set of standards and fail to meet them. But where do we get these standards in the first place? How do we come up with our normative theory? So there's a deep sense in which reason has to be autonomous. So reason is ultimately autonomous, not as a god, but because it has to be the source of the norms that constitute and govern reason. So reason is the source of the norms that govern reason.
Okay.
We have to be the standard.
Okay, so I think I'm following it a little bit more. This isn't necessarily his position that he's putting forward. He was repeating. I didn't note down who was Cohen that was doing the specific one. And Cohen's kind of like theory for rationality is we're the ones creating the standard of like our idealized selves, and then we're trying to act up. We're trying to act to actualize, I guess, that idealization, but we're going to falter. But all the falterations that we have are just performative incapacities to do these things. So like we're trying to meet the standard that we're setting forward. And it's like a constructivist setting of a standard of like, a rational person would do X. I'm going to do X. I failed to do X, but I was still trying to do X. And the reason I failed to do X was I didn't have the capacities in my localized time and space area in which I was trying to do X. And so in the lecture after that, he kind of goes up against that. But so I don't know, maybe the parallel with the Euthyphro dilemma isn't quite a valid criticism of Vervaeke, but more so a criticism of Cohen there. But of course, it's an unreasonable criticism to make, since Vervaeke was the one kind of bringing up the Euthyphro dilemma there.
Yeah, and it seems like where he's leaving it off is that we're not done with this investigation into rationality. Like maybe the last thing to talk about just is this construal that he talks about at the end of 41. That really we have to look into how we can. So we need a normative construal, so norms and how people interpret, make sense of, size up, and how they formulate the problem. That has to be independent of inferential norms. That there's a non-inferential aspect to rationality that deals with understanding and relevance. And he says, so relevance is pre-inferential. And so we have standards on which good problem formulation is versus bad. So bad formulation puts you into a combinatorially explosive search space, and not paying attention to how the salience is misleading you. Remember, salience misleading you, like in the lily pad we were talking about. And insight is crucial to being rational. But this is where I think more research has to be done. He says that we propose that we need to understand both the role of insight and the inference in rationality. And that's much more problematic. I'm not sure if that's where he's going into next lecture. But,
right, because what 42 is also directly about wisdom, rationality. So, yeah. So, do you want to go on, Brett?
I think we've covered most of the stuff for today, and especially if next week we're still on this topic. I think it'll maybe feel like he's done these lectures of let me set it up, and then I'm going to contradict what I set it up, but I'm going to do it like half an hour later.
Yeah.
So we'll have the full picture, I'm guessing, by the end of next week. So
sure.
that'll bring us back in. Tyler and Nick, do you have anything else to add?
Not particularly. I feel like there's something hanging in that youth road dilemma that I wanted to get at, but I am not. Maybe it'll come back up on the next one.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. He sort of threw it out there, and it's. I don't know if we even really should go into it because it's not directly related to the topic of rationality.
Yeah. And it might help when as a useful example, when we're kind of meeting the next lecture is wisdom and rationality. So where the two intersect, it might become more important or useful.
Yeah. It's very interesting the way that he's kind of reframing rational, or I don't know if it's necessarily a reframing. It's at least been a reframing for me. Reframing rationality as to be very much normative in nature, that there are things in which, there are relevant pieces of information that ought to be focused on. And then from there, we can kind of build up.
We're stuck in the a priori framework of being a person. And we can do steps to escape it, right? To push the boundaries of, right, abstract, whatever personness is to its most fundamental quality and try and get out of it. But there is some point where it always presents some type of obfuscation of whatever pure rationality might be.
Right.
Well,
so that's where the wisdom and rationality seem to start synthesizing and conflicting with each other, perhaps.
It's like it has to be normative, I guess, because it's linked to competence, right? So what's normative is what's within our competence.
Sure, it is relevant, like connected to competence, but it's also in regards to like, okay, we're a human being. There are certain things in which being a human being requires, and so we're focusing on those things in which a human being requires in order to sort of to build up our rationality upon as well. And I don't know, he hasn't really said that in so many words, but there is at least a prominent feature of relevancy as being necessary to cognition, and maybe not necessary exactly, but something we ought to use to inform our cognition.
Well, it is necessary even at the most abstract levels. We still have to combat the combinatorial explosiveness even at the most abstract, right? Where it seems totally divorced from.
Right. It's funny because I was thinking the reason I said it's not necessary is because there are certain types of cognition that and I'm using cognition lightly, that can take place without any sort of like relevance realization or raising in higher priority and weakening another priority, and through like robotic or algorithmic cognition that takes place in like sorting algorithms and things like that. Like I don't think that requires any sort of relevancy realization, mostly for the fact that I don't think machines are capable of it. But it is funny that you brought up combinatorial explosion, because that's a problem with machines. Like you have the halting problem within Turing machines, that like if a machine is supposed to reference itself, like the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox is something that you can input into a machine to basically like completely throw it off to the point that it's not able to operate at all. Like divide by zero. You can't do that. But with humans, we're able to, okay, divide by zero. Can't do that. Okay, I'm going to ignore trying to divide by zero.
And so what ends up happening is that we program the machines to try and dodge the combinatorial explosiveness so that they're useful to us, right? So there's like this little thread of, no matter how hard we try, if we want to come up with a useful result, we have to be inputting some amount of this, almost contextual, arbitrary information in order to allow the thing to do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that actually makes his whole project seem, I guess, higher in relevancy now, because he brought it up early in the series, I think, in like, okay, if we're trying to have a theory of cognition, this would be very helpful for building up artificial intelligences, because if we can map our artificial intelligences to be similar to the way that we already perform cognition, then that'll at least get us a step closer in machines exhibiting behaviors or performing cognitive actions similar to humans. And so, if we know what these problems are, we can kind of input them in so that we can work around it in a way.
Work around it, I'm almost wondering if the end result is not, or of his next lecture that we're moving into is almost something like you can't have rationality without wisdom. Right? It'll break itself. It can't function without wisdom as its kind of counterpoint. And that's where you throw kind of the loop kind of comes in, right? Where this seemingly, we don't know how to encode wisdom. It's seemingly something that happens within the, right? He's obviously done his very best to encode wisdom almost in an abstract sense. But there's some level where the observer kind of sneaks its way back in, right? Personhood kind of almost becomes an impossible paradox that, right? That's the projection of rationality is deeply tied to the recognition of something called wisdom, which is deeply tied to realizing relevance. You get this really weird a priori looping almost, or I don't quite know how to, a strange loop. I'll just rely on the Hofstadter here again.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, and we'll probably have to wrap up. But that at least
I came back just in time to hear Hofstadter.
that at least helps me to recognize what is the differentiation between Peterson and Vervaeke, because on first glance, they're very similar in how they kind of approach things from a psychological perspective, very much rooted in Darwinism, things like, and like actually caring about philosophy and theology.
Psychology, I think, is pretty important.
Sure. But yeah, and I think the difference in, I guess, their metaphysics, or at least their relevancy realization, is Peterson still holds to, Peterson still attributes some sort of personality to the, I guess, Hegelian God of acting within history, whereas I don't know if Vervaeke really does so, because I think like the undergirding of relevancy realization is impersonal. Like there isn't a personal like being there that says, okay, this is salient and that's what I'm going to focus on. It's something that's from the bottom up, even though the bottom itself is impersonal and provides us the salience. From emptiness, personhood can come about. Whereas I think with Peterson, and it's hard because
where's
Peterson,
the static and where's the dynamic, right? Again, it kind of gets to this ultimate level, right? If we pose an impersonal universe, we in a sense focus all personalness on ourselves, right? If we pose a personal universe, we are allowed in some degree to escape into the impersonal from our own frame, right? It's these weird
kind of a Nagel's view from nowhere, where we can kind of accept this impersonal viewpoint, when in fact it's a
because
viewpoint
we're
that doesn't scale
assuming the
up to.
context of a personal universe. Yes, and it doesn't scale. Yeah, that's the same thing I was talking about before with like, it's best to put it's my argument at least, it's best to put the inconsistent at the very peak of your system. Otherwise you get lost in Gödel's trap, right? Otherwise you're stuck within this kind of knot of like an infinite recursion.
Yeah.
But if you just accept the inconsistency up front, a priori, now you can actually make a consistent system.
You give me one miracle and I can build up a whole system of science from it, or something like that.
Yes,
and at least with Thomas Nagel, he kind of accepts that, like, okay, consciousness doesn't make any sense if the undergirding of reality is completely impersonal. So I'm going to posit that the undergirding of reality, every single particle and atom and things like that, has some sort of semblance of consciousness, which can then kind of be built up off of each other. And so Nagel, I believe, is a panpsychist. Honestly, I'm not. I think that is sort of a legitimate worldview for consciousness, in which that, at least intuitively, it kind of makes sense that, like, okay, at the very bottom foundation, there's small semblances of consciousness, and then you build these up like Legos, and then you can kind of get ultimate consciousness of some sort.
Yeah, complexity arising properly from its complicated parts.
There is a problem. I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough or heard from other panpsychists. I think actually Vervaeke's conversation partner, J.P. Marceau, who's he's a panpsychist, and I'd have to like listen to more of his stuff. But I think there is sort of a problem that I haven't at least heard an explanation for, of like, how does individually conscious things form together into a larger conscious thing. Like, I would, like, if
still end up relying on pods, reference to integrated information theory, or you end up relying on things that can explain the phenomena regardless of whether the fundamental particles are conscious or not.
Right. So like, I imagine I have 5 people, and then I kind of have them loop arms with each other and like stand in a circle. And each person has 180 degree area of vision or something like that. And so collectively you would have 360 degrees of vision, but that doesn't mean that there is a singular organism. It's not the case that there's a singular organism that has 360 degree division, 360 degrees of vision going on there. It's just all these.
And likewise, you would actually expect the opposite, which is that while you now have been granted this ability of 360 degrees of vision, you've also added an enormous amount of friction and a kind of unresponsiveness to your system, where it lacks the ability to immediately respond to that ability of 360 degree vision, because each person has to communicate with each other what the other's experiencing. So I'm hinting towards entropy. You would imagine basically stacked layers of entropy that would be unable to add up to something like a unified conception of self, or
okay, so maybe that's
any number of operations we find humans performing.
Maybe at least one option in which you could have this kind of like building up of consciousness is through some sort of communication, where it may be the case that, like, okay, the individual cells in my foot are conscious of my slipper that I'm wearing right now, but the experience that I'm having of my toes curling right now isn't that same experience that my toes are having. They're just transferring some sort of signal back to one cell, to the next cell, to the next cell, to the next cell, of like doing this like long game of telephone all the way up into my ultimate conscious self. And I'm just being told a story of what my individual cells or nerves at the base of my foot are doing. And that might be one way in which the panpsychist.
The problem then just becomes, is that chain of communication adequate to explain the phenomena of a unified self and what it is capable of from this top-down perspective? Or are the entropic principles, right, the telephone game on the way through all those cells, right, does that not make sense within the frame, within what we know the unified self is able to perform?
Yeah.
Right. People hitting baseballs with bats at 90 miles an hour. Right. There's a number of examples where we go, oh, it looks like we're missing something. Right. The obvious chain of communication does not seem adequate to explain what is actually occurring.
I'll have to reread Thomas Nagel's, what was his book? Mind and Cosmos. That's it. Because when I first read it, I was like, highly confused. It was very much more technical than I was prepared for. I might be able to get a better understanding. It's a small book, but it's surprisingly dense. And I
have not read it, so I'm
it's good. But yeah, like I said, dense. And I actually downloaded what's Tononi's book on consciousness that I'll be reading as well, so that hopefully I at least get a better understanding of integrated information theory, because that might provide a better system of consciousness than at least the panpsychists have. That way, at least I'll get a better understanding of kind of how it goes. But yeah. All right, I think we're done for there. I'm like feeling the brain shutting down. Gotta like hurry, get all the things out as best as I can. All right, yeah, thanks everybody for showing up. Thank you very much, Concept Hut, for interacting in the comments with us. And thank you also to Craig for joining in, as well as Tyler. I don't know if Tyler's away or not. I know he said he had to kind of go in and out. So, and also thanks Nicholas and also Brett. Here. There you are. All right. And I have links down below. Everyone should check out Brett's notes for the episodes. Like even if you're kind of like behind, like you're just coming in and like, oh my gosh, there are 40 episodes into the series. You can kind of skim through that. So if there's any terms that we use, like combinatorial explosion, what is that supposed to mean? You can look in there, like do it like a word search, and that'll at least give you the episode where that happens. And then you can get kind of a definition for all these terms that Vervaeke likes to put out there. But yeah, thanks everybody. Good night.